Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
When my husband and I finally bought our dream home, I thought we were starting a new chapter in our lives. Just the two of us, free to enjoy our hard-earned success. But I never expected my mother-in-law to show up, bags in hand, and declare herself the queen of the house. She marched in like she owned the place, took our master bedroom, and smirked as she said, "I deserve the best room, because I am still the queen here." At first I was stunned, then I smiled. Instead of arguing, I handed her some paperwork that wiped the smug look right off her face. She had no idea what she had just walked into. Buying a house had always felt like an impossible dream. One of those distant fantasies that you tell yourself will happen someday, but never quite believe until you hold the keys in your hands. But here we were, standing in front of our new home, hearts pounding with excitement as Ryan fumbled with the lock. "Are you ready for this?" he asked, flashing me a grin. I laughed, squeezing his arm. "More than ready. Open the door already." With a dramatic twist of the handle, he pushed the door open, and we stepped inside, expecting to be greeted by the scent of fresh paint and new beginnings. Instead, what we found made my stomach drop. Sitting right there on our living room couch, sipping tea like she had been living there for years, was Linda, my mother-in-law. At first, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. Maybe we had walked into the wrong house? Maybe I was hallucinating from all the stress of moving? But no. The familiar scent of her overpowering floral perfume told me otherwise. She looked completely at ease, her legs crossed, a throw blanket draped over her lap like she had made herself comfortable hours ago. The bags beside her, multiple suitcases in an overnight bag, suggested she wasn't just visiting. "Surprise!" she chirped, setting her teacup down with a clink. "I figured you'd need help settling in, so I moved in early." I blinked. "Moved in?" Ryan hesitated beside me, shifting uncomfortably as his gaze flickered between his mother and me. He clearly hadn't expected this either. "Mom," he said slowly, What do you mean you moved in?" Linda beamed, completely ignoring the tension that had settled in the room like a thick fog. "Well, you two are so busy with work and moving is such a hassle." I thought, why not make things easier for them? So I got the spare key from your old apartment and let myself in this morning. "You're welcome." I was frozen in place, trying to process the insanity of what she had just said. She had let herself into our house. Without permission, without an invitation, without even telling us. Ryan ran a hand down his face, already looking exhausted. "Mom, this isn't what we talked about." Linda waved a dismissive hand. "Oh, nonsense. You always say how much you appreciate my help. And honestly, you two have this whole big house. Why would you even need all this space to yourselves?" That was when it clicked. This wasn't just temporary. She had moved in for good. I swallowed hard, trying to stay calm. "Linda," I said, forcing a polite smile, "we're really happy you want to help, but Ryan and I were looking forward to having our own space. We didn't expect company." Her expression didn't change. If anything, her smile widened. "Oh, don't be silly, dear. You'll love having me around." I shot Ryan a sharp look. He needed to handle this. This was his mother, after all. But Ryan? Ryan looked like a deer caught in headlights. And that was when I knew this was going to be a nightmare. Ryan and I stood frozen in place, the weight of what had just happened settling on my shoulders like a heavy blanket. I had imagined so many things about our first day in our new home. The excitement, the unpacking, the laughter as we celebrated with takeout on the floor of an empty living room. But never, not in my worst nightmares, had I imagined my mother-in-law standing in the middle of my house, acting like she owned the place before I even had the chance to take it in myself. Before I could find the words to process the situation, Linda rose from the couch with the kind of confidence that made it clear she had absolutely no intention of asking permission for anything. She smoothed out the front of her silk blouse, picked up one of her suitcases, and marched past us without so much as an explanation. It took me a second to realize where she was going, but when she turned down the hall, it hit me like a punch to the stomach. She was heading straight for the master bedroom. Panic shot through me as I hurried after her, my pulse pounding in my ears as I tried to wrap my head around what was happening. Surely this was a misunderstanding. Maybe she was confused and thought she had a designated guest room waiting for her. Or maybe she was just looking around. But the second I stepped through the doorway, that hope was crushed. Linda stood in the center of our bedroom, her sharp eyes scanning the space with an approving nod, as if she were inspecting a hotel suite that had been specially prepared for her arrival. Without hesitation, she walked over to the bed, tossed her suitcase onto the mattress, and turned to me with a look of absolute satisfaction. "This will do," she said, nodding as she placed her hands on her hips. "I deserve the best room because I am still the queen here." I let out a short, breathless laugh, waiting for her to crack a smile, waiting for the punchline to this ridiculous joke. But her expression remained perfectly neutral, her chin lifted in the way someone does when they expect no pushback, no argument, no resistance at all. She was serious. I opened my mouth, then closed it again, struggling to process the level of entitlement in front of me. Was this actually happening? Was she really claiming my bedroom, in my house, like it was something she had any right to take? I turned, half expecting Ryan to jump in and say something, to tell his mother that she had obviously misunderstood, that this was our private space, that we had never, not once, invited her to live with us. But when I looked at Ryan, he just stood there, his mouth slightly open, blinking like he had short-circuited and was still trying to process what was happening. That hesitation, that tiny pause where he didn't immediately shut this down, was enough to send a hot wave of frustration surging through me. I turned back to Linda, planting my feet firmly against the hardwood floor, forcing myself to stay calm, though I could already feel my patience unraveling. "Linda," I said as evenly as I could, "you can't just decide to take the master bedroom. This is our house. This is our space." She let out a dismissive scoff, as if I had just said something childish and naive. "Oh, sweetheart," she said with a condescending chuckle, "you're so young. You'll learn soon enough that these things don't matter in the long run. What's important is that family stays together, and I have always been the matriarch of this family. It only makes sense that I take the biggest and best room. You and Ryan can have one of the others. You don't need all this space to yourselves." She said it so casually, as if she had just suggested something completely reasonable, as if it was completely normal for a mother-in-law to swoop in and take over a newlywed couple's bedroom without warning. Ryan finally found his voice, but it was weak, uncertain. "Mom, come on, this isn't—" Linda cut him off with a loud, exaggerated sigh, shaking her head like we were both being difficult for no reason at all. "Ryan, don't be ridiculous," she said. "You're my son. I've done so much for you. I raised you. I sacrificed for you. I made you into the man you are today. And now that you finally have a beautiful home, you want to push me aside? After everything I've done?" Her voice trembled slightly on that last sentence, her eyes glistening with the kind of weaponized sentimentality that I was sure had worked on Ryan a million times before. And, judging by the guilt flashing across his face, it was still working. I could practically see the internal battle raging in his head, his instincts telling him that, yes, of course, this was insane and unacceptable, but also the deep-seated guilt of a boy who had spent his entire life trying to please the overbearing mother who had raised him. I took a slow breath, willing myself not to lose my temper, because I already knew Linda thrived on control. If I snapped now, if I raised my voice, if I showed even an ounce of emotion, she would use it against me. So instead, I forced my lips into a tight smile and nodded slowly. "Okay," I said, my voice deceptively light. "So, if I understand correctly, you think it's reasonable to move into a house that isn't yours, take the master bedroom that belongs to someone else, and act like it's completely normal?" Linda's smile faltered just slightly before she recovered. "It's not like that, dear. I'm just trying to make things easier for everyone." I tilted my head, pretending to consider her words. "Interesting," I said, "because from where I'm standing, it looks a lot like you're making things easier for yourself at our expense." She pursed her lips, her gaze hardening. "I don't appreciate your tone, young lady." And there it was, the shift, the first crack in her performance, the moment when she realized I wasn't going to roll over like Ryan did. Good. Let's see how much she really thinks she's the queen. I turned to Ryan, arching an eyebrow, silently demanding that he step up and do something before this got even worse. He swallowed hard, then finally squared his shoulders and said, "Mom, you can't just move in without asking. We never agreed to this." Linda blinked at him, stunned for a brief second before her expression morphed into something carefully controlled. "Fine," she said, lifting her chin. "If that's how you feel, then I suppose I'll just stay for a little while. Just to make sure you two settle in properly." I could already see where this was going. If we let her stay for one night, she would never leave. And I would rather set this house on fire than let that happen. I turned to Ryan, my heart pounding as I waited for him to speak, my frustration bubbling beneath the surface as I silently pleaded for him to put a stop to this madness before it went any further. He had to see how absurd this was, how completely out of line his mother was being, how this was not just some minor misunderstanding, but a blatant power play. He had to step in, stand up for us, make it clear that this house was ours, and that she had no right to claim any part of it, let alone the master bedroom. But instead of asserting himself, instead of shutting this whole situation down like any reasonable person would, he just rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly, his eyes darting between me and his mother like he was trapped in the middle of a war he hadn't been prepared to fight. "Mom, we never said you were moving in," he started, his voice uncertain, his words lacking the firm conviction I so desperately needed to hear from him in that moment. His hesitation was like a slap in the face, a painful reminder that when it came to his mother, he had spent a lifetime walking on eggshells, always trying to keep the peace, always afraid of upsetting her, always defaulting to giving in rather than setting boundaries. And she knew it. She had conditioned him to be this way, to never challenge her, to never question her authority, to always let her have her way. Linda waved a hand dismissively before he could say anything else, laughing lightly as if his concerns were nothing more than a child's silly worries, something unimportant and easily brushed aside. "Oh, Ryan, don't be silly. It makes perfect sense. You two have the rest of the house, plenty of space to make your own. But this is the best room in the house, and I deserve the best." Her voice was coated in that sugary sweet tone she used whenever she wanted to manipulate a situation, pretending to be lighthearted and reasonable while making it absolutely clear that she wasn't asking for permission. She was stating a fact, declaring her right to what she wanted, making it clear that she expected no resistance, no argument, no discussion. I clenched my fists at my sides, my nails digging into my palms as I fought to keep my anger in check. Was this really happening? Was my mother-in-law seriously standing in my house, in my bedroom, declaring herself the rightful owner of the space I had spent years working toward, saving for, dreaming about? And worse, was my husband really standing there, saying nothing, just letting her bulldoze over us like this? Ryan looked like he was about to faint, his expression shifting between discomfort and guilt, his hands tightening at his sides as he tried to find the right words, as if there were any words that could possibly make this situation better. But I wasn't going to wait for him to figure it out. I had already made up my mind. I wasn't going to let Linda walk all over me, and I certainly wasn't going to let my husband stand there like a scared little boy while she treated me like an outsider in my own home. I took a slow, deep breath, forcing my voice to remain calm, steady, controlled. "Linda, I understand that you're used to being in charge, and I respect that, but this is our home. Ryan and I bought this house together, and we've been looking forward to making it our own. We never discussed you moving in, and we certainly never agreed to giving you our bedroom." Linda's smile faltered for a split second before she recovered, tilting her head slightly as she crossed her arms over her chest. "Oh, sweetheart, don't take it so personally. I just thought it would be easier for everyone if I stayed here. I mean, who's going to help you settle in, show you how to run a proper household, teach you all the things you still need to learn?" I forced myself not to react, but my stomach twisted in irritation at the sheer condescension dripping from her words. She wasn't just taking our space. She was making it clear that she saw me as inexperienced, as someone who needed guidance, as someone beneath her. She was placing herself at the head of my household, declaring herself the authority figure in my marriage, establishing herself as the dominant force that Ryan and I were apparently expected to cater to. Ryan cleared his throat, stepping forward slightly, as if he was finally about to say something useful. But before he could speak, Linda turned to him with a soft, knowing smile, her voice lowering into something almost pitying. "Ryan, honey, you understand, don't you? I'm your mother. I've always been there for you, taken care of you, made sure you had everything you ever needed. This house is just as much a part of me as it is a part of you, and I know you don't want to push me away after everything I've done for you." And there it was, the guilt trip, the manipulation, the reminder of how much he owed her. I watched as Ryan's resolve wavered, his shoulders tensing, his gaze dropping slightly, as if he was actually considering what she was saying, as if he was already starting to fold under the weight of her words. And that was when I knew if I didn't put my foot down right now, if I didn't make it absolutely clear that this was not up for debate, that this was not happening, then I would spend the rest of my marriage fighting for control of my own home, my own space, my own life. I squared my shoulders, lifting my chin slightly as I met Linda's gaze head-on. "Linda," I said, my voice firmer now, sharper, leaving no room for misinterpretation. "You are not moving into this house. You are not staying here. You are not taking our bedroom. I don't care how much you've done for Ryan. I don't care what you think you deserve, and I don't care what you assumed when you decided to show up here unannounced. You need to find somewhere else to stay, because this is our home, not yours." For a brief moment, Linda looked genuinely stunned, as if she hadn't expected me to push back, as if she had assumed that I, like Ryan, would crumble beneath the weight of her self-proclaimed authority. But then, just as quickly, her expression hardened, her lips pressing into a thin line as she straightened her posture, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly. "Well," she said, her voice icy now, the fake sweetness gone, "I see how it is. You don't want me here. You don't appreciate everything I've done. You want to separate me from my own son, push me away like I'm nothing. That's fine. If that's how you feel, then I suppose I'll just have to stay a little while longer, to make sure you don't ruin everything before you even have a chance to get settled." And just like that, she turned on her heel, walking toward my closet, as if she had already won. Ryan let out a quiet sigh, rubbing his forehead as he looked at me, with an expression that almost looked apologetic. But all I felt was a slow, burning rage. If Linda wanted a battle, she had just started a war. There were 1,000 things I wanted to say, a million ways I could have reacted. But in that moment, I forced myself to take a slow breath and do something that went against every instinct in my body. Instead of arguing, instead of fighting, instead of giving her the satisfaction of seeing me upset, I smiled, wide and pleasant, as if nothing about this situation bothered me at all. I tilted my head slightly, keeping my voice light and sweet, and simply said, "Of course, Linda. Make yourself comfortable." For the briefest second, I saw something flicker in her eyes, something calculating, something that told me she had fully expected resistance, maybe even prepared herself for it. But when I didn't argue, when I didn't stomp my foot and demand that she leave, she hesitated just slightly before breaking into a smug, satisfied grin. She thought she had won. She thought her presence was something I had just accepted, something I had no choice but to tolerate. She thought I had already given up, already surrendered, already decided to fall in line like Ryan always did. And that was exactly what I wanted her to believe. The next few days were some of the longest, most infuriating days of my life, but I played my part perfectly. I smiled at Linda when she made passive-aggressive comments about how the house wasn't as clean as she liked it. I nodded politely when she gave unsolicited advice about how to properly care for a home, and I even managed to keep my tone pleasant when she loudly pointed out all the things I should be doing differently as a wife. Every morning, I woke up to the sound of her voice, demanding something from Ryan, asking for coffee, requesting breakfast, casually mentioning that the sheets in her bedroom weren't soft enough. She was settling in like she had always planned to be here, like this was her home, like we were the guests and she was the rightful owner of everything around us. She had breakfast in bed, not once lifting a finger to help with anything in the house, not even pretending to acknowledge that she was a guest and not the owner. She barked orders at Ryan, treating him less like a grown man and more like an obedient little boy who existed only to cater to her whims. She dismissed me like I was a maid, not even pretending to hide the fact that she considered me a secondary presence in my own home. Every time she opened her mouth, every time she spoke, every time she tilted her chin and declared herself the queen of this household, I bit my tongue, smiled sweetly, and played the part of the quiet, accommodating daughter-in-law she assumed I would be. But what she didn't know, what she would never see coming, was that I had a plan that had been forming the moment she walked through that door, a plan that would ensure that this little fantasy of hers would crumble faster than she ever expected. She thought she had everything under control, thought she had manipulated her way into a permanent place in our home, thought she had successfully made herself untouchable. But very soon, she was about to lose everything. The morning I had been waiting for finally arrived, and as I moved through the house, I felt an unsettling calm settle over me, the kind of quiet anticipation that comes just before a storm. For days, I had played along, pretending to be the obedient, accommodating daughter-in-law, smiling through gritted teeth as Linda walked around my home like she owned every square inch of it. I had watched her parade through my kitchen, criticizing the way I arranged the cabinets, instructing me on how a real woman should manage a household, as if I had been some clueless girl in need of her superior wisdom. I had endured her barking orders at Ryan, treating him like he was still a little boy under her control, never once acknowledging that he was a grown man, a husband, a partner with his own household to run. But worst of all, I had watched her settle into my bedroom, the one place in the house that was supposed to be mine, a space of privacy and peace that she had taken without hesitation, as if she had every right to claim it. She had sprawled out across my bed, draped herself in my expensive sheets, rested her head against my pillows, and acted like she had conquered the home we had worked so hard to buy. Every time I passed by that room, every time I saw her relaxing in a space that was never meant for her, the fire inside me burned hotter, but I kept my face neutral, my tone pleasant, my patience unwavering. I had waited for this moment, planned for it, and now it was time to show her exactly how wrong she had been. With the thick stack of papers clutched in my hands, I made my way toward the master bedroom, my steps slow, steady, deliberate, savoring the weight of what was about to happen. When I pushed the door open, I found her exactly where I expected her to be, lounging in my bed, one hand holding her phone as she scrolled through whatever meaningless nonsense kept her entertained, the other resting lazily on the comforter like she had no care in the world. She looked perfectly at home, utterly unaware that her reign was about to come crashing down around her. I approached the bed with a polite smile, setting the papers down on the nightstand beside her with a deliberate thud, loud enough to draw her attention. For a brief second, she glanced at them, her eyes flickering with mild curiosity before shifting back to her phone, barely acknowledging my presence at all. The sheer arrogance of it all, the way she couldn't even be bothered to look at me properly, as if I were some insignificant servant in her house, only made this moment that much more satisfying. "Linda," I said, keeping my voice soft and pleasant, deliberately giving nothing away. "Since you're so comfortable here, I figured you should see these." She let out an exaggerated sigh, not even bothering to lift her gaze from her screen as she waved a dismissive hand in my direction. "Whatever it is, just handle it," she muttered, her voice carrying the same detached boredom she had used all week. "I trust you." "Oh, Linda." She had no idea. For a long moment, I said nothing, simply watching her, letting the weight of what was about to unfold settle over the room like a thick, unseen fog. The silence stretched between us, but she didn't seem to notice, too wrapped up in her own delusions to realize that something was shifting. She had spent so much time believing she was in control, so much time assuming that I was too weak, too passive, too polite to push back, that it never even occurred to her that I had been planning this moment since the second she walked through my front door. I reached down, picked up the top document from the stack, and placed it directly on her lap, forcing her to acknowledge it. This time, she glanced down, her lips pressing into a slight frown as her fingers absent-mindedly brushed over the paper. "What is this?" she asked, finally showing the first signs of interest, though her tone was still laced with mild annoyance, as if she was already prepared to dismiss whatever inconvenience I had placed in front of her. I folded my arms, tilting my head slightly, keeping my expression neutral. "It's the paperwork for the house, Linda," I said, watching her closely, waiting for the moment she truly processed what I was saying. "Since you've made yourself so comfortable here, I thought you might want to see whose name is actually on the deed." The frown on her face deepened, her fingers gripping the paper a little tighter as she skimmed the words, her eyes darting across the page in quick, frantic movements. Her lips parted slightly, and for the first time since she had waltzed into my home, she looked uncertain. She flipped to the next page, her breath hitching ever so slightly as realization started to sink in. I watched as her posture stiffened, as her fingers trembled just a little when she turned to the following page, her breathing growing shallow. Her eyes darted back to mine, her usual smug confidence replaced with something far more vulnerable: shock. I took a slow step forward, lowering my voice just enough to make sure she caught every single word. "You see, Linda," I said, my tone light, almost conversational, "Ryan and I bought this house together, but what you never bothered to ask, what you never even considered, was whose money actually paid for it." She blinked rapidly, her mouth opening and closing like she was trying to form words but couldn't quite manage it. I smiled, enjoying this far more than I probably should. "Ryan contributed, of course, but the majority of this house? The down payment, the mortgage, the legal documents, all of it is in my name." Linda's breathing turned shallow, her fingers gripping the papers so tightly that I thought she might tear them. But Ryan," she stammered, looking at him as if expecting him to jump in and tell her this wasn't true. Ryan, to his credit, only sighed, rubbing the back of his neck as he finally spoke. "Mom," he said, his voice tired, "she's right. The house belongs to both of us. But legally, the primary owner is her." And just like that, the last trace of Linda's smug superiority evaporated, her face going pale as the truth settled in. She wasn't the queen of this house. She wasn't in charge. She wasn't entitled to anything. For the first time since she arrived, she finally understood she had no power here. I took my time settling into the chair across from her, making sure every movement was slow and deliberate, allowing the weight of the moment to sink in before I spoke. Linda still held the paperwork in her trembling hands, her eyes darting across the pages as if she could somehow will the words to change, as if the reality of what she was reading might shift if she just looked long enough. I could see the way her mind was working, the way she was trying to process what this meant, the way she was struggling to find some kind of loophole, some way to twist this in her favor. But there was no way out for her. No manipulation, no guilt-tripping, no carefully crafted speech that would undo the truth staring her in the face. I folded my hands neatly on the table in front of me, tilting my head slightly as I watched her reaction unfold with a kind of detached amusement. Her breathing had quickened, her lips pressing into a thin line, her fingers gripping the paper so tightly that I thought she might tear it right down the middle. The confidence she had carried since the moment she walked through my front door was slipping away with every second that passed, the foundation of her arrogance crumbling beneath her feet. And still, she said nothing, refusing to meet my eyes, refusing to acknowledge what she was reading. "Oh, I already did," I finally said, my voice quiet but firm, letting each word settle into the air between us like a final nail in the coffin. Linda's frown deepened, her eyebrows knitting together as she finally looked up at me, her expression a mixture of confusion and growing fear. For so long, she had believed she was untouchable, that no one, not even me, could challenge her authority, that she would always be the one in control. But as her eyes met mine, I saw it. The first flicker of doubt, the first real crack in her carefully constructed armor. She looked down at the papers again, this time scanning them more frantically, her fingers flipping through the pages faster, her breathing turning shallower. And then, just as I had expected, the moment came. The exact second when the truth fully registered, when her entire world shifted in an instant. She sat up so suddenly that the blanket she had wrapped around herself slid off her lap, pooling onto the floor in a forgotten heap. Her wide eyes snapped back to me, her mouth slightly open, as if she wanted to speak, but couldn't quite form the words. "What? What is this?" she finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper, the confidence she had carried earlier completely gone, replaced with something dangerously close to panic. I leaned in slightly, allowing my fake, patient smile to drop completely, letting her see just how much I had been holding back, letting her realize that she had never really won, that she had never actually been in control, that all this time, I had simply been waiting for the perfect moment to end this. "It's the house deed, Linda," I said, my voice laced with satisfaction. "And guess whose name isn't on it?" Her face drained of color, her knuckles turning white as she gripped the pages, her breath catching in her throat as she realized exactly what this meant. Linda, the self-proclaimed queen of this household, the woman who had spent days acting like she ruled over me, the woman who had claimed my bedroom without a second thought, the woman who had assumed she could simply take what she wanted, had absolutely no power here. Linda's hands trembled as she flipped through the stack of papers, her fingers gripping the edges so tightly that the pages crinkled under the pressure. She wasn't just reading anymore. She was desperately searching for something, anything, that would contradict what she had just seen, anything that would give her the upper hand again, anything that would prove that she still had control over the situation. But there was nothing. No hidden clause, no overlooked detail, no loophole she could exploit to twist reality back into her favor. It was all there in black and white, plain as day, undeniable, absolute. Her breathing grew uneven, her chest rising and falling with the weight of the realization that was slowly, painfully settling over her. She turned another page, scanning the document with frantic eyes, her lips parting as if she were about to say something, but no words came. The color had drained from her face, her usual air of superiority shattered, replaced by something far more satisfying, pure, unfiltered shock. For the first time since she had waltzed into my home uninvited, she looked small, uncertain, completely and utterly lost. But Ryan owns this house," she stammered, her voice shaking just as much as her hands, her eyes snapping up to meet mine in desperate confusion. She wasn't asking a question. She was begging for confirmation, for reassurance, for Ryan to step in and tell her that this was all just some huge misunderstanding, that everything she had assumed was still true, that the foundation of her arrogance hadn't just been ripped out from under her. I tilted my head slightly, taking my time before responding, letting the tension stretch between us, letting her sit with the weight of her own false assumptions for just a little longer. Then slowly, I leaned forward, folding my hands neatly in front of me, making sure she could see just how calm, just how composed, just how certain I was. "No, Linda," I said, my voice even, steady, unshakable. "I own this house. My money. My name on the paperwork. My rules." The moment the words left my lips, I watched as the last remnants of Linda's composure crumbled right in front of me. Her entire body went rigid, her face twisted into something between disbelief and horror, her mouth opening and closing like she was struggling to find something, anything, to say. Her eyes darted toward Ryan, searching for confirmation, for denial, for some kind of intervention that would reverse the reality she had just been confronted with. Ryan, who had been silent until now, let out a slow breath, rubbing the back of his neck as he finally spoke, his voice quiet but firm. "Mom," he said, his tone carrying none of the hesitation he usually had when speaking to her, "she's telling the truth. The house belongs to both of us, but legally, it's in her name. She paid the majority of it. She owns it." Linda blinked rapidly, shaking her head, her mind clearly refusing to process the reality that had just been placed in front of her. But that doesn't make any sense," she burst out, her voice rising, her hands gripping the stack of papers like they might somehow change if she just held onto them hard enough. "Ryan, honey, you're the man of this house. You're the one who should be in charge. You're the one who should be making these decisions. You're my son. How could you let this happen?" Ryan sighed, and for the first time in a long time, I saw something shift in him, something different, something stronger, something firm. He wasn't backing down, he wasn't faltering, he wasn't trying to smooth things over like he usually did. He was standing by me, standing with me, not as his mother's son, but as my husband, as my partner, as someone who had finally realized that it was time to draw a line. "Mom," he said, his voice carrying a finality that even she couldn't ignore, "this isn't your house. You don't get to make the rules here." Linda's breath hitched, her fingers curling into fists as she clutched the papers against her chest, like they were some kind of shield that could protect her from the truth. She had spent so much time believing she was in control, so much time assuming that she had won, that she had already secured her place as the reigning queen of this household. But the look in her eyes told me everything I needed to know. She had never even considered the possibility that I was the one in charge. She had walked into my house and claimed the master bedroom without hesitation. She had dismissed me as if I were a temporary presence in her son's life. She had acted as if I were the outsider, the guest, the one who needed to fall in line and accept her dominance. But in her arrogance, in her self-absorbed confidence, in her complete disregard for the possibility that she could ever be wrong, she never even questioned whose name was on the deed. And that was her biggest mistake. I leaned back in my chair, exhaling slowly, allowing myself to savor the moment, allowing Linda to sit with the crushing weight of her realization, allowing her to feel the same powerlessness she had tried to force upon me. I could see the wheels turning in her head, the desperate scrambling for a way out, for a way to fix this, to rewrite this, to turn things back in her favor. But there was no way out, no manipulation, no power plays, no last-minute saves. She had lost, and now she had to face it. For the first time since she had forced her way into my home, for the first time since she had claimed my bedroom without even a second thought, for the first time since she had acted as if she was the sole ruler of this house, Linda sat frozen in complete and utter silence. She didn't speak, didn't move, didn't do anything except stare at the papers in her hands as if willing them to change, as if sheer force of will alone could rewrite reality and return things to the way they were in her mind, where she was the queen, where Ryan was the obedient son, and where I was nothing more than a temporary obstacle in her kingdom. Her fingers tightened around the edges of the documents, knuckles turning white, as if gripping them hard enough would somehow reverse what she had just read. The smug arrogance that had been so present in her demeanor earlier was gone, replaced by something hesitant, something shaken, something bordering on actual fear. And yet, I could see the gears in her mind turning, could see the frantic calculations as she tried to come up with a way out of this, as she tried to convince herself that there was still a way to regain control. She lifted her gaze slowly, eyes darting from the papers to me, then back down again, as if she was still waiting for someone to jump in and tell her that this was all a mistake. But no one did. Instead, she turned to Ryan, her expression shifting from disbelief to something far more familiar: manipulation. I watched as she softened her features, as she let out a breathy little sigh, as she tilted her head just slightly to the side, just enough to mimic the kind of motherly concern she had weaponized for years. But Ryan," she stammered, her voice trembling just enough to sound vulnerable, but not enough to be truly sincere. "You own this house. You're my son. This can't be right." She clung to those words like a lifeline, as if saying them out loud would somehow make them true, as if sheer insistence alone would bend reality back to her will. She had spent so much time believing that Ryan would always belong to her, that he would always do as she said, that no matter what happened, he would never put anyone before her, not even his own wife. I saw the flicker of uncertainty in Ryan's face, the old habit of guilt trying to creep in, the instinct to reassure her, to make things easier, to fix things for her, even when she was the one who had caused the problem in the first place. But then, just as quickly as it appeared, it was gone. I watched as something shifted in him, something stronger, something resolute, something that told me he had finally reached his limit. Ryan let out a slow sigh, rubbing his temples, his expression one of sheer exhaustion. He wasn't angry, wasn't emotional, wasn't even particularly frustrated. He was just done. "Mom," he said, his voice carrying a calm finality that even she couldn't ignore. "You can't just take over our house. You never even asked." Linda's eyes widened slightly, like she couldn't quite believe what she was hearing. Like the idea that she should have asked for permission to move into our home was somehow unfathomable. She had spent so much time assuming she had rights here, assuming that her presence was not only accepted but expected, that hearing otherwise was a genuine shock to her system. Her mouth opened and closed a few times, like she was trying to find the right words, like she was searching for the perfect argument to pull Ryan back under her control. But before she could speak, I reached forward, keeping my face calm, my expression unreadable, and slid the final piece of paper across the table toward her. An official eviction notice. The room fell completely silent. Linda didn't touch the paper. She didn't even breathe for several seconds, as if acknowledging it, as if even looking at it for too long would somehow make it real. And then, finally, she did what I had been waiting for her to do. She panicked. She snatched up the eviction notice, her hands shaking as she skimmed the words, her lips moving slightly as she read them to herself, as if saying them under her breath would somehow change what was written. I watched as her expression twisted, as disbelief turned to confusion, then to frustration, then to something dangerously close to rage. Her head snapped up, eyes wild, voice sharp. "You can't do this to me," she hissed, her entire body rigid with barely contained anger. "This is ridiculous. This is my son's house. You can't just kick me out like some kind of stranger." I didn't flinch. I didn't react. I just stared at her, my face giving nothing away, my patience completely exhausted by the sheer audacity of this woman sitting before me. "Actually," I said, my voice even, unwavering, "I can." Linda's breath caught in her throat, her jaw tightening, her hands curling in a fist on the table, as if she were physically holding herself back from throwing a tantrum. She turned to Ryan again, her desperation growing more obvious now, her carefully controlled act slipping further and further away. "Ryan, honey," she pleaded, her voice softer now, dripping with artificial sweetness. "You're really going to let her do this to me? You're really going to throw your own mother out on the street? After everything I've done for you? After all the sacrifices I've made?" Ryan exhaled, shaking his head, his expression unreadable. "Mom, we're not throwing you out on the street. You have your own home. You have plenty of places to go. But you don't live here. You never lived here. And you never asked if you could stay. You just showed up and took over." Linda's face twisted into something ugly, something I had never seen before, something that told me this was a woman who was not used to losing. "You're choosing her over me," she spat, her voice low and venomous, her fingers digging into the eviction notice as if she wanted to tear it apart. "After everything, you're choosing her over your own mother." Ryan didn't even hesitate. "I'm choosing my wife," he said simply, his voice carrying a finality that left no room for argument. "And it's time for you to leave." Linda's breath came in short, shallow bursts, her eyes darting between us, her mind clearly scrambling for some last-ditch effort, some final manipulation, some desperate plea that would make him change his mind. But there was nothing left. She had lost, and deep down she knew it. As she sat there, silent and fuming, I leaned forward, my voice calm but firm, my patience completely gone. "You have 1 week, Linda," I said, my words slow and deliberate. 1 week to pack your things and find somewhere else to stay. Because whether you like it or not, you are leaving this house. She glared at me, pure hatred burning in her eyes, but she didn't argue. Because she knew I meant it. Linda's shriek could probably be heard from miles away, her voice rising to a pitch so sharp and shrill that I was almost surprised the windows didn't crack under the sheer force of it. The moment the weight of reality truly settled onto her shoulders, the moment she fully understood that she was being removed from this house, she completely lost the carefully constructed composure she had been holding onto for dear life. Gone was the smug, self-assured woman who had waltzed into my home as if she were the rightful owner. Gone was the queen who had spent days barking orders and making demands. Gone was the manipulative mother who had spent years guilt-tripping Ryan into submission. What was left in her place was something unhinged, something desperate, something furious. "You can't do this to me," she shrieked, her voice raw with disbelief, her hands grasping at the eviction notice as if she could physically tear the words from the page and make them disappear. "This is a joke. This has to be a joke. I am Ryan's mother. I am family. You can't just throw me out like I'm some kind of stranger." Her entire body shook with rage, her chest rising and falling in rapid, uneven breaths, her face turning an alarming shade of red as she clutched the paper in her hands like it was some kind of death sentence. I simply shrugged, keeping my expression calm, controlled, completely unaffected by the ridiculous theatrics unfolding before me. "Actually," I said, tilting my head slightly, my voice steady and unwavering, "I can. And I am." The second those words left my lips, Linda's entire demeanor shifted, her face contorting into something ugly, something almost feral, her eyes narrowing into dangerous little slits as her fingers curled into fists. She turned on her heel so fast that I thought she might lose her balance, her gaze locking on Orion with a level of betrayal that would have been laughable if it weren't so pathetic. "You," she hissed, pointing an accusing finger directly at him, her voice trembling with barely contained fury. "You're letting this happen? You're just standing there while she tries to kick me out of my own son's home? How could you do this to me, Ryan? After everything I've done for you, after everything I've sacrificed, after all the years I spent raising you, you're seriously going to let this woman, treat me like garbage?" Her voice cracked on the last word, and for a moment, I thought she might actually throw herself onto the floor in full-blown hysterics, just to make her meltdown that much more dramatic. Ryan, who had been standing silently for most of the confrontation, finally let out a slow, measured breath, his shoulders slumping slightly as if he had been waiting for this inevitable explosion. I saw something in his expression shift, something settle, something finally come to terms with what had to be done. He wasn't panicked. He wasn't scrambling for the right words. He wasn't bending under the pressure of his mother's demands. He was simply done. "You did this to yourself, Mom," he said quietly, his voice steady but firm, his eyes meeting hers without a single trace of doubt or hesitation. "You walked into our house without asking. You took over our bedroom without permission. You made it very clear that you had no intention of respecting our space, our boundaries, or our marriage. And now that you're facing the consequences of your own actions, you're acting like we're the bad guys? That's not how this works, Mom. You don't get to manipulate your way out of this one." Linda's jaw dropped, her eyes widening as if she had just been physically struck by his words, as if the simple act of Ryan standing up for himself was the ultimate betrayal, the one thing she had never, in her wildest dreams, expected him to do. She had spent years controlling him, molding him, shaping him into the kind of son who would never challenge her authority, who would never put anyone else above her, who would never prioritize his own happiness if it meant going against her wishes. And yet, here he was standing beside me, standing with me, making it crystal clear that he was no longer the little boy who used to bow to her every demand. Her face twisted in outrage, her hands shaking at her sides, her entire body vibrating with anger so intense that I thought she might actually explode on the spot. "You're choosing her over me?" she spat, her voice dripping with venom, her fingers curling into the eviction notice like she wanted to rip it to shreds. "I am your mother, Ryan. I gave you life. I raised you. I have been there for you since day one. And you're telling me that this woman, this gold-digging, selfish little—" "Enough," Ryan interrupted, his voice firm, his tone carrying a level of finality that left no room for argument. "That's enough, Mom. I won't let you talk about my wife that way. Not now, not ever. And if you can't respect that, then you really don't belong here." Linda's breath hitched, her face twitching like she was trying to hold herself back from completely losing it. But there was nothing left for her to say, no argument left for her to make, no way for her to manipulate her way back into control. She had pushed too far, had taken too much, had finally crossed a line that she could never come back from. I crossed my arms, watching as she stood there, shaking with rage, her face red, her hands trembling, her mind desperately searching for some kind of last-ditch effort to turn this around. But there was no turning back now. The decision had been made. "You have 1 week, Linda," I said, my voice calm, unwavering, completely devoid of sympathy. 1 week to pack your things and leave. Because whether you like it or not, you're leaving this house." Linda let out a furious, strangled sound, somewhere between a sob and a scream, her entire body trembling as she finally realized that there was no way out. She had lost, and nothing she said or did could change that now. The day Linda moved out of our house was the day I finally felt like I could breathe again, the day the air inside our home became lighter, the day the weight that had been pressing down on my shoulders for weeks was lifted completely. The moment the last of her luggage was hauled into the car, the moment the front door closed behind her for the final time, the moment I watched her drive away, knowing she no longer had any control over my life, I felt something that I hadn't felt since the day Ryan and I signed the papers for this house. Peace. She had fought until the bitter end, dragging out her departure as long as possible, spending the final days of her unwanted stay sulking around the house, slamming doors, muttering insults under her breath, making it painfully obvious that she believed she had been wronged. She had always seen herself as the victim, always convinced that she was the one being mistreated, always twisting situations to make it seem as if she was the one being pushed aside, as if everyone around her owed her something. But the truth was painfully simple. She had walked into my home uninvited, had taken what wasn't hers, had assumed a level of control she was never entitled to, and when she was finally confronted with the reality of her own actions, she couldn't handle it. Ryan and I stood by the window that morning, watching as her car disappeared down the road, neither of us speaking for a long time, neither of us needing to say anything at all. The silence wasn't tense, wasn't awkward, wasn't filled with the usual weight of unspoken words. It was peaceful, a kind of quiet that felt like a brand new beginning, a fresh start that had been long overdue. I turned to Ryan, expecting him to look conflicted, expecting him to carry some lingering guilt, expecting him to be struggling with the fact that his mother had just been removed from our home against her will. But when I met his gaze, all I saw was relief. He let out a slow breath, running a hand through his hair, shaking his head slightly as if he still couldn't believe it had come to this. But instead of sadness, instead of regret, instead of hesitation, his next words were spoken with nothing but certainty. "That was the right thing to do," he said, his voice calm, steady, resolute. "She never should have been here in the first place." And just like that, I knew we had made the right choice. For the first time since she had barged into our lives, Ryan and I reclaimed our bedroom, our space, our freedom, and our home finally felt like ours again. I threw open the windows, letting in the fresh air, allowing the house to breathe, allowing myself to breathe, letting every trace of Linda's presence be carried away with the wind. I changed the sheets, replacing everything she had touched, making sure that every reminder of her unwanted invasion was wiped clean, making sure that nothing of hers remained. It was our space now, and nothing, absolutely nothing, was going to take that away from me again. But of course, Linda wasn't the type to go down without a fight, wasn't the type to accept defeat quietly, wasn't the type to simply disappear from our lives just because she had been told she wasn't welcome anymore. The call started the very next day, ringing at odd hours, each one ignored, each one silenced before I even had to consider answering. Then came the text messages, long paragraphs filled with guilt-tripping accusations, self-pitying declarations about how she had been betrayed by her own son, how she had been treated so cruelly by the woman he had chosen over her, how she had done nothing wrong except love him too much. I never responded. When the text didn't get a reaction, she showed up, standing at the front gate, pressing the intercom button over and over, demanding to be let inside, demanding that Ryan come out and talk to her, demanding that we undo the horrible mistake we had made. I watched from the window as she paced outside, arms crossed, lips pursed, her frustration growing with every passing second that we didn't acknowledge her. But I never let her back in, not into my home, not into my peace, not into my life. She had spent weeks declaring herself the queen of this household, had spent years convincing herself that Ryan would always belong to her, had spent her entire life believing she could never be challenged. But queens don't take orders from dethroned rulers, and I had made sure that her reign had come to a permanent end. Looking back, standing my ground was the best decision I had ever made, the most important decision I had ever made, the one decision that had set the foundation for the life Ryan and I were meant to have together. If I had backed down, if I had let her stay, if I had allowed her to sink her claws deeper into our marriage, she would have never left, would have spent every day pushing her way further and further into our lives, would have controlled everything from the color of our walls to the way I spoke to my own husband. But I hadn't let that happen, and because of that, because I had drawn the line, because I had refused to let her manipulate her way back into power, she no longer had any control over us. Now, when I wake up in the morning, I don't hear her voice barking orders from the kitchen. Now, when I walk through my house, I don't feel like a guest in my own home. Now, when I sit beside Ryan, I don't see a man torn between his wife and his mother. I see a husband, a partner, a man who had chosen to build a life with me, not live under the rule of a woman who refused to let go. Now, my house is exactly what it was always meant to be mine.